Welcome to GRE. I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. I'm here at the world's largest gathering of free minds. It's a conference called FreedomFest, where I talk to the conference founder. He's been named one of the top 20 living economists in the world today, as well as a talk with one of our GRE investment coaches to learn what my conference takeaways are and more. Freedom, life, liberty, and the pursuit of real estate and investing. Today on Get Rich Education.
Since 2014, the powerful Get Rich Education podcast has created more passive income for people than nearly any other show in the world. This show teaches you how to earn strong returns from passive real estate investing in the best markets without losing your time being a flipper or landlord. Show host Keith Weinhold writes for both Forbes and Rich Dad Advisors and delivers a new show every week. Since 2014, there's been millions of listener downloads in 188 world nations. He has A-list show guests include top-selling personal finance author Robert Kiyosaki. Get Rich Education can be heard on every podcast platform, plus it has its own dedicated Apple and Android listener phone apps. Build wealth on the go with the Get Rich Education podcast. Sign up now for the Get Rich Education podcast or visit GetRichEducation.com.
You're listening to the show that has created more financial freedom than nearly any show in the world. This is Get Rich Education.
Welcome to GRE, from Oswego, New York to Lake Oswego, Oregon, and across 188 nations worldwide. I'm Keith Weinhold, and you are inside Get Rich Education. I'm attending FreedomFest live and in person in Las Vegas today. One key economic freedom and what makes a free market free is that ability for producers and suppliers and landlords to set prices based on what the market will bear, whether that's a high price or a low price. Now, what's wrong with rent control, which is a law that puts a ceiling on the amount of rent that you're allowed to charge? Well, that sounds like a nice thing to do for one set of people in the short term. Well, rent control has the same effect as price controls on consumer goods. If the government thinks that cars are becoming too expensive and they set up a new law that says that you can't charge more than $20,000 if you want to sell a new car, well, then those manufacturers will stop producing cars. And soon enough, you, the consumer, cannot buy a car. You'd no longer have an automobile market at all. And the consumer suffers under no choice and even austerity. Put price controls on beef jerky and companies will stop making beef jerky. Put price controls on rent, called rent control, and now landlords have zero incentive to provide property, no motivation to improve property. And there is a raft, just reams of evidence and studies out there that show that rent control, that is a surefire way to then reduce the supply of functional housing, just like the supply of cars or beef jerky would get cut. That's especially not a good solution in today's real estate supply-constrained world. And you know, here's what's interesting. The government created the inflation in the first place that led to the high price problem that they think they can cure through rent control. I mean, government keeps trying to solve a problem that they created. Well, just take a new course, a new direction, and stop the inflation, and that way you'll cure the higher prices long term. And then nearer term, what you can do is relax zoning requirements in order to create more housing. I mean, in 3 cases here, less government cures the problems. No inflation, no rent control, and thirdly, no stringent zoning. Knock down all 3 of those walls, and instead, now what have you done? You've encouraged a bunch of builders to come into a market. You've encouraged competition, and what does competition do? It increases quality, and it lowers prices. So cure the problem by knocking down the walls. You know, you as a landlord, I don't even think that there should be laws that say that you have got to charge every tenant the same rent amount. Yeah, and that is even if each one of your tenants has seemingly identical units, say in a fourplex building. Now, I've owned different fourplex buildings, and I have most everyone, like throughout history, I've had just about every tenant pay different rent amounts in the same building, even though all of the units were built at the same time and have the same square footage. Now, a real estate investing newcomer, they might think that that sounds unfair, that these tenants with basically identical units pay different rent amounts, but we all know how it works in practice in real life. I mean, one of those four tenants might have the front unit with the best views. Well, the tenant with the best view, well, of course they're going to be willing to pay more for that unit. Well, that right there, that's free market supply and demand. The fourplex unit with the best view will rent out faster and for more. But instead of that arrangement, if it's mandated, say by the government, that everyone in the building must pay the same rent, say that each of the four units must pay exactly $2,000, well, then the tenant with the worst view, which then has less benefit to living there, has to subsidize the tenant with the best view that already has the best benefit of living there because they must all pay exactly $2,000. And then what about things like several months from now, say you have a vacancy at Christmas? Well, it's hard to get a tenant to move at Christmas to get them in there, so you'll charge a low rent just to get someone in there then, versus how you charge more now in summertime because tenants demand units. A lot of them want to get settled in during the summer before the school year starts. What about a tenant that's lived in your fourplex or rental single-family home for 5 years and their unit hasn't been painted or renovated in a while and the tenant has seniority? Well, they're probably going to pay less than a new tenant will in their, say, freshly painted unit. So my point is that even making every tenant of one individual fourplex building have to pay the same rent amount, well, that is a form of rent control, and that is actually unfair if they all have to pay the same rent amount. The free market is what's fair and enables a system of rent price discovery instead of being confined and oppressed under rent control. Now, here to FreedomFest in Las Vegas, and we'll discuss the conference more today, I attended one panel discussion. It was called How the Government Created the Housing Crisis and What We Can Do to Fix It. And it really gave specific solutions to provide more housing. This includes things like stop mandating a minimum square area for parking spaces. Stop mandating such large lawns. Instead, people can share a public park, and relax the requirements that have so many easements on a property. Well, all that stuff is zoning, and it stifles development, and it leads to higher housing prices. Now, I maintain that not all zoning is bad. I don't think that you want a housing development surrounded by factories with smokestacks. So it's about relaxing zoning in the right way and promoting the right policies, like the benefits of a NIMBY movement. Yes, in my backyard. Removing off-street parking mandates altogether and allowing more ADUs. Allow single-family homes on smaller lot sizes. And we've already seen some of that. We're seeing home builders do more of that. They're building single-family homes closer together, smaller lot sizes. But a lot of the wrong strategies exist out there. And once people get the benefits, like the beneficiaries of these wrong strategies, I mean, they don't want to give them up. Like New York's rent stabilization program that gives rent breaks to wealthy New Yorkers that also have a pricey home out in the Hamptons. Well, that's not the right policy. That's not helping the people that need it most. And when the wrong policies infiltrate a market, the reaction can be amazingly rapid. I mean, how rapid? Like, do you think you would see a construction project literally halt mid-construction? Yeah, you actually can. Like, construction cranes just stop swinging. In St. Paul, Minnesota, you saw construction cranes stop mid-air, mid-construction, when St. Paul moved toward a rent control of no more than 3% annual rent increases. Oh, well, that's a form of rent control. When that happens, building stops because the developer knows that people don't want to buy those units or invest in those units or rent those units. And I've got more to discuss on housing shortly, but let's bring in the very founder, host, and producer of FreedomFest here. He has been named as one of the top 20 living economists in the world, Dr. Mark Skousen, and you will hear some background noise in these conference interviews. We are at a conference. At times, we're in the exhibit hall. Now, interestingly, here with Mark, I bring up with him how much I dislike these political labels that just divide the nation. I mean, don't you agree that it would be great if the nation were less divided? Yes, we all would. But we can do our part by avoiding saying words like red and blue. And no, I can't stand those maps that you see. I've mentioned this to you before. You see these maps in political season that show where the red states are and where the blue states are. I mean, how divisive and polarizing. That is not unifying in the United States of America. The fact that this conference has a non-divisive founder like Mark Skousen is what attracted me here. Sure enough, here you'll hear me tell him how much I appreciate this. This was prescient because the very next day after this interview that you're about to hear, that was the assassination attempt on former President Donald Trump. Hey, it's Keith Weinhold here at Get Rich Education. I'm at FreedomFest with FreedomFest host and founder Mark Skousen. Thanks for having us here, Mark.
Yeah, my pleasure. My pleasure. Thank you for coming.
Well, I've got to tell you, one reason that attracted me to this conference, I was concerned that it was going to be too politically partisan, and I respect you so much because I know you have said that in most or all the books you've read, you've avoided these labels like liberal, conservative, left, right, red, blue, yes, progressive, conservative, and all that. So that's what I liked hearing. When we talk about this conference championing principles of freedom and liberty, what does an American really need to know about freedom and liberty that's under attack today?
Well, I think what we try to preach is the Adam Smith model, which he called the system of natural liberty. And what that meant was under the rule of law and justice and a robust competitive model, you maximize the freedom of choice, freedom to choose your own work, your own business, how much salary you're going to charge or wages you're going to pay, whether you can hire or fire people. So within those rules, within those guidelines, you have maximum security. But in today's world, more and more, everything is either being prohibited or mandated. So we're being squeezed from both sides. The idea of FreedomFest, to maximize freedom, is for us to come together and find out what are the best solutions to improve our lives, is the idea. So we talk philosophy, history, science and technology, healthy living, economics, politics. It's all part of the program here, but it's not just a political conference.
Part of this is lowering the guardrails and promoting free markets.
Yeah.
One thing that we've all seen happen in free markets is inflation, oftentimes, ironically, created by some of those forces that put guardrails in place. So what does an investor, there are a lot of investors here.
Oh, yeah.
What does an investor need to know with regard to inflation today? How can the everyday person respond?
So one thing is we have a whole section on financial freedom, because without financial freedom, you're limited in what you can do and your influence that you can have. So this is very important. We live in an era of permanent inflation. Since World War II, we've had permanent inflation. We didn't used to, but now we do because we're off the gold standard. We've adopted Keynesian economics, which means deficit spending all the time. We have adopted the dollar rather than gold. So we've lost that discipline. The Fed is the engine of inflation. And they even have a policy of a minimum of at least 2% inflation.
Right.
We had a whole session. Actually, Steve Forbes wasn't there, but Nathan Lewis is co-author of the book Inflation. We had a big session on what are the best inflation hedges. So we talked about gold and silver, the stock market, Bitcoin,
Real estate.
high bonds, real estate. We had all of those discussion. And that was the great thing about FreedomFest, is that you really do get answers and best solutions at our conference.
I attended that particular session.
Oh, you did?
Yes.
Yeah.
From Freedom Fest. I've really enjoyed this so far. We have an exhibit hall, which happens to be right next to us.
Yeah.
We have breakout sessions that attendees can go to for the sessions that particularly interest them, or then a big general session where I've enjoyed presentations from Robert Kiyosaki to Ice-T. What is a future potential Freedom Fest attendee? What would you like to tell them about what this conference entails, what they can expect, and the value that they can get?
Well, one of the things is just the wonderful camaraderie that you feel, the buzz that you feel, the meeting of like-minded people who are all trying to seek best solutions rather than labels and attacking people. And we have the presidential debate here, for example. Well, we have all the third parties coming together, the Libertarians, the Constitution Party, the Green Party. We have RFK coming. The two major parties decided not to come, so much for their belief in democracy. But the idea is there's something for everybody here. You want to improve your lifestyle. You want to improve your financial situation. You want to have better clarity on what is the proper role of government. Freedom Fest is a conference for you. This is an annual event that we usually have in the summer in Las Vegas and then other cities. And it's only 3 or 4. We live busy lives. So can we come together once a year to learn, to network, to socialize, and celebrate liberty? I think we can if we plan ahead.
When we drop these labels, we can get a clear download of thoughts, remove filters, and think clearly. And this is a largest gathering of free minds. So for Mark Skousen, I'm Keith Weinhold. You heard Mark Skousen mention the presidential debate at Freedom Fest. I watched quite a bit of that. More on it later. GRE Investment Coach Naresh is here in person with me at Freedom Fest. Coming up, he and I give you a download of some policy and real estate investing highlights that you can learn from. That's straight ahead. I'm Keith Weinhold. You're listening to Get Rich Education. Hey, you can get your mortgage loans at the same place where I get mine, at Ridge Lending Group, NMLS 42056. They provided our listeners with more loans than any provider in the entire nation because they specialize in income properties. They help you build a long-term plan for growing your real estate empire with leverage. You can start your pre-qualification and chat with President Chaley Ridge personally. Start now while it's on your mind at ridgelendinggroup.com. That's ridgelendinggroup.com. Your bank is getting rich off of you. The national average bank account pays less than 1% on your savings. If your money isn't making 4%, you're losing your hard-earned cash to inflation. Let the liquidity fund help you put your money to work with minimum risk. Your cash generates up to an 8% return with compound interest year in and year out instead of earning less than 1% sitting in your bank account. The minimum investment is just $25,000. You keep getting paid until you decide you want your money back. Their decade-plus track record proves they've always paid their investors 100% in full and on time. And I would know because I'm an investor too. Earn 8%. Hundreds of others are. Text FAMILY to 66866. Learn more about Freedom Family Investments Liquidity Fund on your journey to financial freedom through passive income. Text FAMILY to 66866.
This is the Millionaire Minds T. Harbeck. You're listening to the powerful Get Rich Education with Keith Weinhold. Don't quit your daydream.
Hey, well, we're here talking about Freedom Fest, and I'm doing that alongside GRE Investment Coach Naresh. Hey, welcome in, Naresh.
Hey, Keith.
We are here in real life at Freedom Fest in Las Vegas, Nevada. And what Freedom Fest does is it promotes and champions the ideals of freedom in the United States. And it includes a bunch of guest speakers that have made appearances here that you got to see in person, from Ice-T to Robert Kiyosaki to a bunch of presidential candidates as well. So I'm talking about championing principles of things like freedom and tolerance and liberty and tyranny. And I think anyone can agree to freedom on this basis. But when you think it through, and where the discussion really begins is, oh, well, if you have freedom, does that mean you should be free to do anything at all that you want? Probably not. And that's quite a discussion. Or tolerance, that's an ideal that sounds good, but does that mean you should tolerate absolutely anything? No, probably not. So that's where a lot of the interesting policy decisions and a lot of the interesting debates come in here. And Naresh and I attended some of these presentations together, and other ones separately. So we have some different perspectives on what we've learned here at Freedom Fest. Naresh, why don't you tell us about some of the good takeaways that you've had?
I had a lot of good takeaways, Keith. This is not just about freedom in the United States. It's about freedom around the world. And you even interviewed, and I believe we're playing that interview soon, if you haven't already played it yet, you interviewed probably the freest nation in the world. It's a brand new nation, and it's called Liberland, like Liberty Land, Liberland in Europe, and it touts itself as the freest nation in the world. So there have been all sorts of topics happening or talked about, from business, finance, economics, real estate, crypto, Bitcoin, gold, to non-business and financial topics, which I actually found more interesting simply because most of what I listen to and watch is business, finance, econ. I wanted something a little bit different, especially as a father of two young boys. There were topics on gender and sexuality and vaccinations, being vaccinated versus unvaccinated. Robert F. Kennedy was the keynote speaker at this conference, and he's a major presidential candidate.
RFK Jr.
RFK Jr.
Party candidate.
Even though he's not part of a major party, he's probably the most popular third-party candidate over the last 30 years. So he's a candidate. There were lectures on healthcare and how to be a better patient and hold your doctor and hold the healthcare system accountable. The other aspect of this conference is there are some heavy hitters just walking around freely. Like, I met Matt Ridley easily. I met Robert Kiyosaki. He was dressed in very casual clothing to where people didn't even recognize him. And I did, and told him how much I appreciated him. He knows you and the GRE podcast, and he's a huge inspiration for me. You have people like Kiyosaki walking around freely, presidential candidates walking around freely, many third-party candidates, not just RFK. He wasn't walking around as freely. He was in and out pretty quickly with really heavy security, but he had other third-party candidates like the Libertarian Party candidate and the Green Party candidate walking around freely. I ran into Vivek Ramaswamy's campaign manager while getting pizza. We were both standing in line getting pizza. We ended up having about almost a 2-hour lunch one day, talking finance, business, Vivek's policies, his future. So overall, this conference, very educational inside the classroom, very beneficial outside the classroom. We're going to bring some guests on the GRE podcast who we met at this conference, publicists who we met at this conference who represent good guests, some business development opportunities, maybe some not just good guests, but people who we would recommend their newsletters, maybe even outside of the real estate industry, people contacts within the real estate industry. So it's not all about what you learn in the classroom. It's also about who you meet, the networking, the business development. Overall, just a really, really successful experience.
There were a few shows that snagged me as a guest while here as well. I'm talking about American freedom here chiefly, but you did mention Liberland, a startup nation between Croatia and Serbia that's 7 square kilometers in area. You know, I think there are a lot of people at a conference like this and just anywhere in society where if you ask them, well, hey, if you think you could run the nation better, if you were starting it all over again, how would you start a nation from a clean slate? And I actually got an opportunity to do that when I'll be interviewing the president of Liberland here, where this country is trying to seek recognition from any nation. They want to start their own country, and they want to do freedom and really begin a country off.
Their currency is
cryptocurrency.
Is Bitcoin, I think, not just crypto, but it's Bitcoin. And it's interesting because you hear a lot of the time, oh, if you don't like the country that you live in, go somewhere else. These people took it to an all new level and said, well, we're just going to start our own country. And it's about 3 square miles. So it's about the size of the area that I lived in Tampa. Not even Tampa, just almost the neighborhood that I live in Tampa. So it's not a huge country, but it's interesting talking to them. And as you'll hear in the interview, hearing about what it's like to start a new country. And there's a lot that you have to go through. You know, there's a lot of fundraising, if you want to call it that you have to do. It's a lot. It's bigger than a business.
You'll learn more about that on an upcoming episode of the show with the nation of Liberland. I attended a presentation called A Forgotten Solution to the Housing Crunch. Most people think of real estate development as either single-family homes or multifamily properties, this espoused the building of light touch density of 2 to 4 unit properties and how that increases the density, but it maintains character. And they showed an awful lot of photos in the presentation where from a street, a 4-unit building can actually like a single family home when it has the right design. And therefore, you don't get this NIMBYism pushback. I saw a number of smart design examples of that. And, what this does, when this helps keep the cost of housing down in an area, what it allows for in a society is it allows the children who grew up in an area to afford the housing there without being priced out. Also call this multifamily's missing middle, 2 to 4 unit housing. You don't have the NIMBYism pushback that you do with multifamily housing. There are an awful lot of opinions here about people who want to avoid rent control, about how that's typically the bad policy. Many liken rent control to bombing American cities over time because landlords don't have an incentive to improve anything. So rent control is not a good solution to increasing the housing supply. And a lot of the discussion was how you get politicians to say no to rent control, like sharing with them Cato Institute studies on how the free market really makes for a higher housing supply because that makes developers want to come into the market. And it was noted in one of the panel discussions about rent control and about providing more affordable housing that if there's a 4-unit building of owners of all 4 units of that building, how that's deemed as less threatening than if there's a 4-unit building of renters.
So, question for you: the housing panels that you attended, were these people, were they private investors? Did they work for private equity companies? I think maybe a documentary filmmaker who does real estate documentary. What was their background?
Think tanks, and yes, a documentary filmmaker of a film called Shabification. And I did not get to see the film about the perils and ills of rent control called Shabification, but I talked with one of the people that worked on the project, and basically that movie, it does glorify the landlord. That was brought up. Typically in popular culture, you don't glorify the landlord. I mean, the landlord is kind of the beleaguered party in this. And it was critical of rent control there, Shabification. So it's helping to spread an awareness of how that really doesn't help the housing supply quantity or quality over time. I attended another presentation. It was called Homelessness, California versus Texas. And homelessness, of course, it's a multifaceted problem. There are a number of reasons that it occurs, but they really brought up that it often results from the loss of family connection, a lot more often than what some people think. And it really brought to light that Houston has a lower proportion of homelessness than LA and San Francisco does. What are the reasons that is the case? And that is because Houston has a lower proportion of homelessness because it's a lower cost to build there. And Houston has way fewer zoning requirements. You see almost like a hodgepodge of building across Houston. You have substantially less NIMBYism in Houston. You just have a culture there that doesn't push back on building. So those are really some of the key parallels between why the homelessness crisis is worse in California than it is in Texas. In most places, Austin actually has policies that are somewhat countercultural to the rest of Texas, giving Austin a somewhat higher homelessness rate.
Wow, well, that's a lot of real estate content that you got there. Anything else, Keith?
Another presentation I attended was called Permanent Rising Prices, What Are the Best Inflation Hedges? And for a while, they didn't even put real estate up there as one of them. And I was almost foaming at the mouth, getting ready to ask a question, but they did bring in real estate at the end. When it comes to inflation, many of them brought up the fact that we have multi-trillion-dollar deficits even when we're in good times. I had never thought of it that way before. If most people would look at the history of the world and what's happening with the nation when they're running multi-trillion-dollar deficits, they probably think that they're trending toward poverty and austerity, but that's not the case. This is what's happening in good times. And politicians, they really don't run on a platform of reducing our debt. You notice that none of the politicians do that. Instead, you see politicians run on platforms like immigration or the housing shortage or abortion. But, politicians, they don't run on a platform of reducing our debt. And that's because they all see it as a problem that they didn't create. And they don't really want to work their way out of it either. So that's why it doesn't come up. Also, with the best inflation hedges, they showed the rank of asset performance for the last 200 years of 5 items: stocks, bonds, treasury bills, gold, and the dollar. And really, it was coming down to 2 guys debating on whether stocks or gold were better. They both made their case either way. And they didn't bring in real estate until the end. But when they brought in real estate, they broad brushstroked it and do what so many do. And they just looked at it as an asset class in what is its capital appreciation over time.
Yeah.
And, they didn't separate out income property as its own class like we would. But some of the panelists, they did not like real estate. They talked about how it's not liquid, about how you have to borrow funds, about how there's a maintenance burden and a repair burden with real estate, and you have tenants and management and some things like that.
All fair.
All fair points. And one panelist brought up that gold has outperformed gold mining stocks just historically over time. So those are some of the inflation hedges and some of the other issues with inflation that you don't think about very much as you have policy advocates and politicians address it.
Well, I'll say gold mining stocks, and most traders will tell you, traders buy gold mining stocks, not investors. So gold mining stocks are meant to be held over the short term. They're not meant to be held over a long period of time like physical, tangible gold is. So for people to say, oh yeah, gold outperforms gold stocks over a 30-year period, that's true. But most people who are buying gold stocks, like gold mining stocks, are only holding over a short period of time.
Well, housing and inflation were such widespread themes here since it has been such a problem, much of it wrought by the pandemic. As we wind down here, summarizing what we've experienced at our first Freedom Fest for each of us, do you have any last thoughts with respect to housing and inflation since they were such overarching themes?
Well, the common theme here at Freedom Fest was government, get out of the way.
Yeah.
Because if you let the free market work itself out, if you let people be people, work themselves out, put the onus on people to take personal responsibility, that in and of itself solves the inflation problem because you don't have government restrictions, government mandates. And this was a major topic, and that was the lockdowns of 2020, the mandatory vaccine mandates of 2021. Those were all inflationary because when you have people fired from their jobs or dropping out, quitting their jobs because they didn't want to take this job, that means prices are higher. A lower workforce means you have to pay whoever is there higher wages, and that's what ended up happening. So it's not just about dollars and cents. It's something as simple as getting a job caused inflation. And ultimately, when inflation goes up, of course, that's going to affect rents. That's going to affect housing. There was a major savings rate, which I'm sure you covered in 2020, where people were saving money being locked down at home. And once things started opening up, that money was spent and that created inflation. And people, as soon as they could get out of their house, said, hey, I want to move to Florida, or I want to move to Texas or Utah or where we are here in Nevada. And that's why housing values exploded. So the inflation was caused by government. It wasn't just the government spending. It was actual psychological and physical things that the government or policies that the government did that created inflation. The government spending, the low Federal Reserve interest rates are just a piece of the pie, or they're just a couple of pieces to the pie. And so it was interesting to learn that all these other areas, all these other, like I said, policies that the government enacted, and that's what Robert F. Kennedy Jr., RFK, talked about in his keynote speech, all of these policies affected the purchasing power of our dollar.
We have all had more dollars chasing fewer goods and services, one of those being housing itself. Hey, it's been great to meet up here in real life at Freedom Fest this year, Naresh. I appreciate you sharing your thoughts.
Thank you, Keith. It's been great.
Yeah, Naresh and I enjoying Freedom Fest here. Oh, there's such a wide variety of vendors and viewpoints all around this concept of free thinking, typically with getting government out of the way. In fact, in the exhibit hall, which is right across from where the speaker discussions are, there are booths for gold, real estate, cryptocurrency, stocks, a dating app for unvaccinated people, self-directed IRAs, a program for teaching capitalism to school children. There's even a booth that espouses biblical capitalist virtues, and then elsewhere in the exhibit hall, atheist virtues. There was also a promoter of a currency called the Nevada Goldback, and what it is 1/1000th of an ounce of 24 karat gold, and it is physical, like goldback. It looks sort of like a dollar bill, and just much, much more in the exhibit hall. Now, one concept that I did not hear any criticism about was Trump tariffs. Tariffs are not free market. In fact, it's akin to erecting a trade wall. And maybe there was a session about it, but there are many sessions going on concurrently, and I can't attend them all. And in other sessions, I was asked to be a speaker and was interviewed. Like you heard Dr. Skousen mention, there was a presidential debate here. Now, the two major party candidates didn't attend. I watched RFK Jr. speak here, an independent candidate, and he was not in the presidential debate, though. He spoke separately, and the security for RFK Jr. was formidable. Even though he spoke the day before the Trump shooting, the presidential debate was among three different parties. It was Jill Stein of the Green Party, Randall Terry of the Constitution Party, and Libertarian Party candidate Chase Oliver, who is a particularly bright, articulate guy. And most or all of those candidates, they agreed that we should end the Federal Reserve. And the presidential debate, interestingly, was moderated by Congressman Thomas Massie, who has more formally proposed ending the Fed. Outside of the presidential debate, I also attended a different session. It was a Bitcoin debate called Will the Bitcoin Bubble Ever Burst? And you had two guys promoting and talking about the virtues of Bitcoin, and then you had two guys criticizing Bitcoin. And one of the two Bitcoin critics was Whole Foods founder John Mackey. So this really got interesting. Now, I like a lot of the benefits of Bitcoin personally, but I must say, in this particular debate, the Bitcoin critics, the side that Mackey was on, they won this. The proponents' best points were that people back in the day said electricity and the internet weren't feasible. They weren't going to last, but electricity and the internet won, and Bitcoin will too. The pro camp also espoused that Bitcoin is the first time we've had absolute digital scarcity. You cannot copy and paste Bitcoin. But yeah, the critics did a better job. They said that Bitcoin has always made future promises, but it falls short, like its awful acceptance rate as a currency still today. Its price levels are dreadfully volatile, just miserably volatile. You can't count on it then as a store of value. John Mackey said that Bitcoin produces no goods, no services, and no cash flow. The Bitcoin critics also asked more than once this question: how has Bitcoin made anyone's life simpler, easier, or better? There really weren't any good answers to that question, and they even critiqued that with its fixed supply at 21 million, well then it cannot grow with the economy. And then what this can do is create deflation and depression. And I would like to add here myself that each Bitcoin is already divided into 100 million tiny pieces called Satoshis, and it might be able to be divided smaller than that eventually. But yeah, the Bitcoin critics won. It is quite a win for Bitcoin, in my opinion, that this nascent digital asset that was only worth a few pennies 15 years ago when it came out. I mean, it was something that only cryptographers and digital geeks understood. Well, today you've got presidents discussing Bitcoin. So it certainly had some success just in branding and name recognition alone. That is just about a wrap from FreedomFest this year here in Las Vegas. There were record-breaking temperatures outside in the Mojave Desert in the middle of summer. Inside, it was a celebration of ideals like life, liberty, prosperity, and of course, freedom. Until next week, I'm your host, Keith Weinhold. Don't quit your daydream.
Nothing on this show should be considered specific, personal, or professional advice. Please consult an appropriate tax, legal, real estate, financial, or business professional for individualized advice. Opinions of guests are their own. Information is not guaranteed. All investment strategies have the potential for profit or loss. The host is operating on behalf of Get Rich Education, LLC exclusively.
The preceding program was brought to you by your home for wealth building, GetRichEducation.com.